y'all. Chapter 18, the landmark history of the American people. Got a picture there of the Brooklyn Bridge connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn. It opened for traffic in 1883. It was 1,500 feet, and it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It's also the world's first steel wire suspension bridge. So I'm actually wondering, before they had that bridge, maybe they're going to tell us more about that. Like, how did they get across? Could they get across? I don't know. Bringing people together, part 4. After the Civil War, so there's this like intro part 4 before we get into chapter 17. After the Civil War, the United States was as large and varied as all of Western Europe. You could find nearly every kind of landscape, from the alpine heights of the Rockies and the Sierras to the tropical Everglades around the Gulf of Mexico. And this variety made the nation more attractive to immigrants from all over. Just as the English could feel at home on the rolling landscape of New England, the Swedes felt less strange on the snowy stretches of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and Italians found similar sunny seacoasts in Southern California. Familiar sunny seacoasts. The imported people, the newcomers, spread across the land. From Chicago to New York was as far as from London to Rome. And wow, isn't that crazy? From Chicago to New York is as far as London to Rome. That's crazy. And if you traveled all the way from London to Constantinople and back, you had still not gone quite as far as if you traveled from New York to San Francisco. How could these spread out people ever become a single nation? People in the United States wanted and needed new ways to feel closer together. This challenged American know-how. And American know-how, using telegraph wires, rails, and new-style bridges, organized new ways to bind a nation. The nation of many cities remained a nation of many centers. Even before the end of the 1800s, Chicago, St. Louis, and Denver were rivaling Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, the old capitals of the eastern seaboard. And by the mid-1900s, Los Angeles on the Pacific was one of the nation's fastest growing big cities. Even before the continent began to seem crowded, American know-how, with materials and techniques borrowed from everywhere, sent skyscrapers high in the air. Thousands of people gathered to live and work in a single towering building. In American cities, in the once wilderness of open spaces and fresh air, people packed themselves closer together than ever before. Here's a Morse telegraph register receiver. There. Okay, so this is a brief moment as the two epochs, or like big, cool, like groundbreaking things, meet. A Pony Express rider passes the transcontinental telegraph line under construction, the meeting of the two epochs of communication. The Pony Express was only open for about a year. It was a year and a half. But when the finished transcontinental telegraph line came out, the service went out of business. And we talked about that in our previous chapter. Horses and riders could not compete with the electrical signals. Okay. So until nearly the time of the Civil War, everybody shares the news, this is called. Until nearly the time of the Civil War, newspapers were not generally very busy. They used up very newsy, not busy. They used up much of their space to print stories, poems, essays, and the strong opinions of their owners. And they copied much of their news from other newspapers that arrived by slow mail. Political parties owned or controlled the best-known papers. They praised their own side and slandered the other. Slandered means like said things that weren't really true. If you wanted to know what was happening far outside of your neighborhood, you had to wait for a traveler to come by. Businessmen and generals organized their own systems to send urgent messages over great distances. One of the oldest was the semaphore, from the Greek words meaning signal bearer. People arranged in advance what their signals would mean. Then they built fires, sent up smoke, or arranged a pattern of boards on a high tower. All of these could be seen at a far greater distance than the voice would carry. The Greeks, Romans, and American Indians had all developed lines of semaphore stations to relay messages for many miles. So what this would mean is, like, if we were going to send a message from where I am in Bulls Gap to where you guys are in Greenville, I would put up a big tower on my farm that had these like boards that would say, hello, maybe. You wouldn't do it with hello, though. Probably it'd be something that really meant something. And then the next people down the way that could see it would do the same thing with their board. And then we do the same thing with their board. It would go all the way, right? So that the message could spread without calling people or whatever. By the mid-1800s, a French semaphore system used 556 separate stations to stretch 3,000 miles. So that's like, my gosh, I think it's about 3,000 miles from New York to California, something like that. But like, you could actually make it go all the way across the United States with these messages. That's pretty crazy. In the 1840s, a young New England go-getter, Daniel Craig, decided to try sending news by carrier pigeons. He ordered pigeons from Europe and trained them for his Pigeon Express. Soon, newspapers subscribed to the service. He would go many miles out into the Atlantic in his boat to meet a ship arriving from Europe. The captain would throw him a watertight canister that contained the latest London newspapers. Then Craig would quickly summarize the news on thin pieces of paper. These he would attach to the legs of his pigeons, and the pigeons then would swiftly fly the news to the newspapers, because these pigeons were like homing pigeons, right? They would go back where they were supposed to. And so there's a picture of that, right, with the carrier pigeons sending news. Craig's pigeons went all the way from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to a newspaper that's in Canada, okay, to a newspaper in Washington, D.C. The New York Sun, let me see if I've got that on my map here, where Nova Scotia is on Canada. I think I have Canada on my map. Got this really cool map here that's got all this stuff on it, but I don't see that it has Nova Scotia in Canada on it, but that's up in Canada. Yeah, that's not on my map, so that's not going to work for me to show you that, but that's okay. They even built a dovecote for its carrier pigeons on the roof of its new building. A dovecote. I don't know what a dovecote is. I'm assuming it may be like a house for them. I'll double check that and I'll put that in my notes for you guys. And there was limit to how much news a pigeon could carry. It was hard to imagine a system that did not depend on seeing signals or on sending written messages. But Samuel F.B. Morse found a way to make an electric current do the job. Morse was a man of many talents. At Yale, he painted portraits of his fellow students for $5 apiece. Then he went to London, where he studied at the Royal Academy, the Honor Society of English Artists. When Morse came back in 1815, he was a famous artist, but he nearly starved because people would not buy his large paintings. So once again, he made a living by painting portraits. At the age of 30, he went to Italy and France, the headquarters for painting at the time. In 1832, on the sailing ship Sully, as he came back from Europe, a talkative young physician from Boston was among Morse's fellow passengers. Dr. Charles had learned a great deal about electricity while he was in Paris. To while away the six away. Okay, see, they say these phrases now and then that just don't really work. To while away the 6-week ocean trip, which means to pass the time. Morse asked him lots of questions. Morse was an educated man, but he still knew very little about the new science. Would electricity flow through a long wire? How fast did it travel? Why couldn't electricity be used to send messages? Others before Morse had asked the last question and got nowhere with their answers. But Morse did not know enough about the subject to be discouraged. He suddenly decided to make an electric telegraph from the Greek words for far righter. As an artist, Morse had a bold imagination about shapes of things, and so right then and there he began to invent his telegraph. Even today you can find the shipboard notebook in which Morse wrote his new ideas. It's in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Before he reached New York, Morse had drawn a picture of a telegraph instrument very much like that used today. He had even planned how to use dots and dashes for his new Morse code. Well, Morse told the captain of the ship as they arrived in November 16, 1832, should you hear of the telegraph one of these days, remember the discovery was made on board the good ship Sully. It took Morse 5 years to make a telegraph instrument that would work. During that time, he supported himself by giving painting lessons. To build a telegraph line required a small fortune. Most people thought the telegraph was nothing but a toy, a thunder and lightning gimcrack. Morse decided to change their minds by a public demonstration. He took his machine with him to Washington, where the Committee on Commerce of the House of Representatives allowed him to demonstrate his telegraph in the Capitol. It was a sensation. The world is coming to an end, one witness declared. Time and space are now annihilated. President Martin Van Buren and members of his cabinet came to see the new electric marvel. The chairman of the House Committee, Congressman Fogg Smith of New Hampshire, saw his own chance to make a fortune. When he asked Morse to make him a partner in a firm developing the telegraph, Morse could hardly refuse. For Congressman Smith had the power to persuade the House of Representatives to give Morse the money to buy a telegraph line. The congressional debate was hilarious. Opponents jokingly proposed that the money be split among Morse's telegraph and supporters of hypnotism and the crackpots who believed the world was about to end. Finally, in 1843, 11 years after Morse had his first inspiration, Congress appropriated or gave him $30,000. With this money, he was supposed to stretch a telegraph line from Baltimore to Washington. Baltimore, I guess, to Washington, D.C., actually, right? So there's actually pictures on the next page. You can see this. This is where he was supposed to get his telegraph line running from. So not Washington State. I don't even know if Washington State was actually an actual state by that point. At first, his partners tried burying the wire. They spent $23,000 before they discovered that because the wire was defective, the buried line would not work. They started all over again by stringing a wire on poles. They were in a hurry to get the job done before the whole Congress began to believe the telegraph was a hoax. Mile after mile, they placed 24-foot-high chestnut poles 200 feet apart. They bored holes in the poles, stuck the necks of the old bottles in holes to serve as insulators, and then threaded the wire through the glass-lined holes. Luckily, in the very moment in May 1844, both of the main political parties were holding their national conventions in Baltimore. This gave Morris his chance to impress the peoples in Washington, who were especially anxious to learn the names of the candidates. But when the candidates were actually selected, Morris's wire still reached only 22 miles from Washington to Annapolis Junction, and you can see that on the page there of 121. To demonstrate his telegraph, Morris had the news brought by train from Baltimore to Annapolis Junction. Then, to beat those who had to carry the news all the way by train, he flashed it over the wire to his telegraph receiving machine in the Capitol. The politicians there were amazed when Morris told them, before anyone else in Washington knew, the names of the Whig Party candidates. That was one of the Democratic parties at the time. Henry Clay for president and Theodore, Frelinghuysen for vice president. This was the first news ever flashed by electric telegraph. The telegraph soon impressed people by other sensational uses. When a thief escaped from Washington by train, his description was telegraphed ahead to the station in Baltimore. There he was arrested as he stepped off the train. Newspaper editors predicted that before long there would be no more crime, since criminals would be too afraid to be struck by this telegraphic lightning. Morris joined two newspaper men to form the Magnetic Telegraph Company. They built new lines from Philadelphia to New York, from Philadelphia to Baltimore, and all around the larger cities. By 1848, the telegraphic network reached Northland to Portland, Maine. Okay, and here's a picture of where they're going. So the brown ones were lines of operation, green is lines of construction, and then lines proposed of how he's trying to connect everybody. The Mexican-American War, the California Gold Rush, and the national troubles that foreshadowed a civil war, all of these whetted Americans' appetite, made them excited for news. And the more news people received, the more they wanted. Because it was expensive to gather news by telegraph, the newspapers came together in groups. Since they all shared the latest dispatches, each of them had to pay only part of the cost of telegraphing the news. In 1848, 6 New York daily newspapers formed the first Associated Press. Their man in Boston took the news brought by ships from Europe and put it in one telegram office to the New York office. Then the Associated Press sold its speedy and reliable dispatches to newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. So they'd pay to get it, and then they'd sell it to the other places. So it wasn't as expensive. Gathering and selling news became a big business. With the news gathering experience of the Civil War behind them, go-getting reporters extended the Associated Press throughout the nation. Then every member newspaper supplied its own local news to all the hundreds of other members. This is actually still how we sort of work. We have local news, and then we have world or national news. They could also afford to open offices with full-time reporters all over the world. This increased the quantity and improved the quality of the news. The Associated Press stories tried not to be prejudiced or one-sided, for their readers were members of all political parties. Papers would not buy the AP news unless it gave the straight facts and wasn't one-sided. By the earliest 20th century, there was also a United Press and an International Press news service. At the same time, many other new inventions were helping to turn out papers faster by the millions. In the early 1800s, an ingenious Englishman improved the presses used by the big city newspapers. Instead of using a frame that went up and down, he used a cylinder. He had the press attach a blank paper to the cylinder and then let the cylinder roll it against the type. This was much faster. Okay, so there's a basic principle of printing prior to 1900, right? And that is just and there it is. And then they have two types of printing press, the flatbed press and the rotary press. So instead of reading all about this, because I think it's a little confusing if you're just reading it, I'm going to put up some videos that are going to help explain what these different presses were like so you can see those. But some metropolitan papers put out 6 different editions each day. So now they're just able to print way faster than they were before. And of course, that's the only way to get news. They put something out in the morning, they put something out at 10, they put something out at noon, right? And you could keep getting the news. Sunday newspapers actually got to the point that they were so big. And this was true even when I was a kid. You guys, a lot of you, I know Eliza's family still gets newspapers at home, but a lot of you don't. But the Sunday paper was always the biggest paper. It always had tons of stuff. It had the comics. It had the fun stuff that you could do on Sunday in the papers. The daily paper was just okay, but the Sunday paper was awesome. And there was so much in it. And we used to get the paper when we were a kid. Sometimes we wouldn't get a subscription. I don't know that we got a subscription, but we buy it. And we bring it home and read the Sunday paper. Okay, so that's chapter 18. And I just want to make sure there weren't any questions I needed to go over about that. Let me just double check. No, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything in particular that I need to go over with that. So I will be posting some videos for you with this.